Okay, this is going to be English colonization part 2, I believe. We're moving now closer to things actually happening. Last time we looked at what the basis of the English claim was, what the limitations, I guess, were, and why there was such a long delay before they followed up at all, and how the initial follow-up attempts fell short. Okay, so to get into toward when things actually rolled, I have to tell you that the Spanish Armada incident of 1588 set off a war between England and Spain that dragged on for 15 years. As far as I know, this was not a armies marching big battle kind of war. It was simply a state of war, which made it completely unthinkable for the English to attempt any kind of settlement in America, because you recall Spain also claimed it. Their claim was, I guess, older in point of time, and they did this to the French a couple of times. That if they discover you settling on land that they claimed, they're not shy about just going up there and killing everybody and burning the place out. So you just can't. Plus, it's hard to get a ship to go where it's sent. You send a ship across the Atlantic, as soon as it's over the horizon, they're going to go play pirates. So you don't have dependable communication. So here's what this waited for a while. Um, Queen Elizabeth I finally died in the year 1603 at the age of 70. Since she never married, it was not obvious at first who her heir would be. There were like a dozen people who had one claim or another, or eligibility to be the English monarch. She herself waited till about her next to last breath to designate an heir, because she knew as soon as she did that, all the toadies who'd been sucking up to her would abandon her to die alone and then go suck up to the next guy. So it's very ironic. She said that her heir should be, as she put it, our cousin of Scotland. Scotland was a separate country and would remain a separate country for 104 more years, but King James VI of Scotland had been King of Scotland ever since he was a baby practically, and he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had executed back in 1580s. Okay, so she died in 1603, and James VI of Scotland, you've heard of somebody wearing two hats, he's wearing two crowns, figuratively speaking. He became King James I of England, initiating a new dynasty known as the Stuarts, Stuart. Now, one of the first things he did was to conclude the war with Spain. War with Spain is over, and significantly, as part of that, Spain did not exactly give the east coast of North America to the British, the English, I should say. They just said, okay, we're relinquishing our claim on that. This leads to kind of a slow-mo feeding frenzy. The English start trying to establish colonies, and did. The French did too. The Dutch tried it for a while, and even the Swedes were involved in what's now Delaware. Um, so that's kind of where we're starting here in the early 1600s. But the question I want to look at in this segment is what factors motivated English people to undertake the colonization of America. Notice I didn't say the English people, where you think of them as a whole nation. Think of them as individuals, individual English men and women. It's not obvious at the time. You look back on history and you think the events that occurred were inevitable and obvious to the people at the time. They just weren't. So it takes some explanation as you think about it. What would motivate large numbers of individual English men and women to abandon the only world they'd ever known, undertake the expense and risk and hazard of crossing the Atlantic in a rickety wooden ship, all to start their lives over again in some howling wilderness populated by who knew what? That takes some explaining. So there are going to be several answers, all of them basically valid. There's one big macro answer and a whole bunch of micro. By the macro, I'm going to start with what would, on a kingdom level or government level, motivate this. Why would generations of English monarchs grant charters to people who wanted to establish colonies? Why would English businessmen risk their hard-earned profits in risky colonial ventures? So that comes back to the economic beliefs that guided kingdoms at that time. These beliefs were just sort of assumptions. Nobody'd really analyzed them or listed them out on a piece of paper or anything like that. They didn't have a name. In fact, they didn't have a name until basically the man who founded the science of economics gave them one in the 1770s. It was a Scotsman named Adam Smith. You don't need to remember this really. And in 1776, of all years, he published a book entitled The Wealth of Nations, in which he summarized and analyzed these beliefs. He was not a fan, by the way, and gave them the name mercantilism. So that's a major term you need to understand. So, by the way, these beliefs are sometimes self-contradictory and not well thought through, but generally I think they hold up. Now, I always start with the fact that the belief that leaders of kingdoms had that the wealth of a kingdom, the power of a kingdom, came down to pretty much one thing, and that was its wealth in the form of gold and silver. All right? That wasn't just pretty stuff, it's what money was physically made out of, because those metals are regarded as having value. You'd be stunned how little gold there actually is that we know about in the world. Silver, much more. But so it's kind of an international competition to acquire gold and silver, because the more of that a king has, the richer he is, the better able he is to put armies in the field and fleets on the sea and bureaucrats in their offices to make himself supreme in his own domain, all of that. So how would a kingdom acquire more gold and silver? And I used to ask this question. This went on for years. I'd get to this point and pose this question, and some clear-eyed, clear-headed student would answer as if I were an idiot. He would say, well, steal it. I giggled, didn't I? I shouldn't have. After all, which kingdom had the most gold and silver? Well, that would be Spain, wouldn't it? Where'd they get it? They stole it from the Aztecs and the Incas down in Peru. So nobody else was lucky enough to find wealthy Indians to rip off. So if you're not Spain, who would you steal it from? Well, Spain. Remember, they find the stuff in what's now southern Mexico and northern South America, and they take it back to Spain on ships. They're big old slow ships, and they're pretty prime targets. So if you could capture one of those things and hold on to it, that'd be a big deal. Now, I'm not telling you this happened all the time. It's really what amazes me is how seldom it did happen. But I mentioned Francis Drake the other day. He showed up at the dock in London with his big old Spanish galleon stuffed with gold and silver in tow. And the Queen, Elizabeth, had invested in his voyage. She didn't invite him to the palace and knight him there. She went down and boarded his ship and knighted him there. That's an international incident. What are you going to do? But to make this make sense, sometimes I like to swap back and forth between an individual level, because this applies, and a national level to explain mercantilism. Now, they've stolen or would like to steal some Spanish treasure. So what's the equivalent for an individual? Let's say you woke up tomorrow morning convinced that you had been denied your fair share of this world's wealth. You ever get that idea? Maybe so. So you're not very patient. You decide to embark upon a life of crime. You go to the nearest pawn shop, buy yourself a 9mm and some ammo, and figure out how to load the stupid thing, and then go start knocking over convenience stores. Tomorrow you gain some confidence, so maybe you try a bank. Would you then have a greater share of this world's wealth? For the time being, you would, till the store clerk hauls out the 12 gauge or the police catch up with you. Had a criminal justice major get pretty miffed at me at this point when those crimes have a very high clearance rate, and I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it, dude. Calm down. Does that sound like a good idea? Could that have downside consequences? Yeah, bad downside consequences. Let's say not you, but your best friend decided to embark upon a life of crime. What would you advise them to do other than embarking upon a life of crime? How could you increase your share of this world's wealth without incurring the risk of going to jail or suffering some other punishment? How about this? Get a job. All right? Exchange your time, your skill, and all of that for a steady income. Nobody's going to get mad at you for that, probably. But then, is that all of it? Or is something else required here? Well, just one thing. You're not going to acquire more wealth unless you can spend less than you make, right? Spend less than you make. Put some away. If you spend all that you make, you're not getting anywhere. If you spend more than you make, it's not going to work out for you either. So there you go. Now we take that back to the national level and we have mercantilism. How could England or France or some other kingdom, I'm not going to say country necessarily yet, it's too early to say nation, how could they acquire more gold and silver without incurring this kind of risk? Simply, really, all they have to do, and this is the essence of mercantilism, simply run what economists call a positive balance of trade. You should have had a half credit in economics in high school. That term should sound familiar to you. A country has a positive trade balance if the value of its exports exceeds the value of its imports. Exports, stuff goes out, money comes in. Your merchants are selling stuff to foreign merchants, money comes in. The value of your imports, that's what you buy. Your merchants buy stuff from their merchants, so you want to sell them more than they buy from you. You have a positive trade balance, and the kingdom at large can accumulate more and more gold and silver as time goes by. The only way you might get in a war on that is just kind of some kind of trade war. Those happen. Okay. All right, that ought to be easy. Just spend less than I make. Yeah, try that sometime. So that's not just automatic, is it? But take it to a national level here. Can you control what other countries buy from you? Not really. All you control is what you buy from them. So the goal to achieve this mercantilistic outcome is to become as self-sufficient as you possibly can, so as to minimize what you have to buy from your trade partners. Now, today we have an enlightened view of international economics, comparative advantage, that sort of thing. So it's seen as mutually beneficial much of the time. In those days, they didn't see mutually beneficial. They saw a rivalry, almost a duel to the death. So the idea being to become self-sufficient, there's a specific cases really did happen, seems almost too textbook to be true. Some bureaucrat in France in the late 1600s got to thinking about the fact that France was a major market for silk. Frenchmen wearing silk, say not so. Well, where did silk come from? Well, it came from China. All the silk came from China. Silk is made from the fiber in the cocoons of silkworms, and they only spin their little cocoons in the leaves of mulberry trees. Neither were known outside France. So why don't we see if we can import that technology? So they did. They found out that mulberry trees will grow all too well in France, almost anywhere else, and the little silkworms don't care where they are. So in only 20 years' time, France went from sending money out to bring silk in to sending silk out to bring money in. I think you see it here. And I'm going to have to come back to this in a minute, and I'll finish up mercantilism in part 3. Bye-bye.